Imagine that you're standing in a muddy trench during World War I, fighting for the British Empire, when you get a message from back home. The very people you're fighting for have sailed a gunboat up your city's capital and are blowing it to pieces. And now they're executing your countrymen by firing squad. This was the reality for thousands of Irishmen during World War I. So today we're going to explore the Easter Rising and a song that it birthed, the Foggy Dew. Welcome to Playing History with me, Oliver Kane, where we look at the history of a song and play a version of it too, so that you might just be inspired to keep it alive yourself. To understand the song, the Foggy Dew, we need to understand the tinderbox which was Ireland in the early 1900s. In 1914, the British passed a Home Rule Bill allowing Ireland to self-govern, but when World War I broke out, they suspended it. Politicians at the time, like Irish nationalist leader John Redmond, essentially sold the young lads of Ireland a dream that the only way to earn the country's freedom was to do their first duty and fight for the British in World War I. Over 200,000 Irishmen enlisted, and they were sent off to the muddy trenches of the Western Front and also to the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in Turkey. But back in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood saw Britain's distraction as their moment. They formed a military council and planned a full-scale rebellion, citing that Britain's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. On Easter Monday 1916, around 1,300 armed men and women joined together from the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and the Women's Republican paramilitary group Cumann na MBan. They seized key strategic locations across Dublin, the most famous of which was the General Post Office, where rebel leader Patrick Pearse declared it as an Irish independent republic. They barricaded the doors and raised the flag of war. If you want to see exactly what this looks like, you can visit the General Post Office today in Dublin. Even though it was shelled and burnt down during the Easter Rising, it was meticulously rebuilt and reopened in 1929. If you visit it now, you can famously see the bullet holes that are on the pillars outside the front of it. So when Ireland took over these locations, the British response was really swift, and they sent 20,000 troops over to Ireland and sailed the HMY Helga up the River Liffey to shell the capital. Much of central Dublin was left in ruin because of the shelling, and although the rebels held out for 6 days, Pearse agreed to an unconditional surrender to save civilian lives. Because of the 485 people killed, 260 were civilians. 143 were British military and 82 were Irish rebels. Many of the civilians were killed or wounded by British artillery fire because they were mistaken for rebels. The true turning point which changed Irish history forever wasn't necessarily just the battle, it was the aftermath, because the British hastily executed 14 of the Irish rebel leaders without a fair trial, and that was only the beginning. They swept through Ireland, arresting 3,000 people, many of which were civilians, and they sent 2,000 of those away to internment camps, the most famous of which was Frongoch in Wales. Britain's sweeping overreaction backfired spectacularly, because by locking thousands of frustrated Irish people in a camp together, historians say that they essentially created the University of Revolution, and inside those camp walls were future leaders like Michael Collins, who networked and studied guerrilla tactics and planned the real war for independence for Ireland. The brutal retaliation and mass imprisonment by the British was a complete shock for the Irish public. How could you send your young people to fight for a country who then comes and blows up Dublin and arrests people and executes people without a fair trial? It was a political awakening. And at the same time, Irishmen were coming back from World War I, who were hardened veterans trained in warfare, and coming back home to realise that the Home Rule Bill was a lie. They essentially switched sides, and they used all these tactics and training from the military to train the newly formed Irish Republican Army. IRA commanders like Tom Barry were hardened World War I veterans, and the British Army had inadvertently trained the very men who would eventually defeat them in the War of Independence. So from these events, the song The Foggy Dew came to be, and even the tale of how that happened wasn't so straightforward. It was originally written as a poem by a priest in 1919. That priest was called Canon Charles O'Neill, and he was a cultural nationalist, deeply dedicated member of the Gaelic League and the Gaelic Athletic Association, and he was trying to revive and keep the Irish language too. When O'Neill attended the very first sitting at Dáil Éireann, the revolutionary, unrecognised Irish Parliament, he was sitting there listening to Cathal Brugh, the Minister of Defence, read aloud a depressing, seemingly endless roll call of Irishmen who were currently locked up in British jails. It was the deep sorrow of this, followed by a rebellious reading of the 1916 proclamation, formal Declaration of Independence, that drove the priest to pick up his pen. But O'Neill didn't compose the music. He actually took that from an existing song called The Foggy Dew, which was famously recorded by an Irish tenor called John McCormack in 1913. The original being a very gentle tune about a woman walking down a hill to meet her soon-to-be husband, and he obviously replaced those lyrics with defiant political ones. He gave credit to Carl G. Hardbeck, who was a blind composer, and he arranged the lyrics to fit the traditional melody. When the song was first published, it was published completely anonymously. Obviously a priest wouldn't necessarily want to have the potential backlash of such a strong political statement, and this song was wrongly attributed to the bloke who wrote the national anthem, the Irish national anthem, called Peter Kearney. And then eventually O'Neill was recognised for his work. O'Neill's goal with the lyrics was to immortalise people and keep the story of what happened alive, and he wanted to teach people as well that it was more important to fight on your home soil rather than being tricked into fighting for someone else on the other side of the world. And in the song he references the battles that happened, so he mentions Suvla or Sud Bar, and he's referencing the beaches in Turkey where thousands of Irishmen were slaughtered in British uniforms. He laments that they'll die in lonely graves instead of being honoured alongside the rebels like Patrick Pearse. Canon O'Neill's powerful poem became a cornerstone of Irish music, really, and it's incredible how far across the world it's travelled, and people who are still keeping the Easter Rising story alive. In 1959, the legendary Odetta Holmes, who Martin Luther King Jr. called the Queen of American folk music, she performed a version of it and introduced it to a huge American audience. She was also known for being the voice of the civil rights movement at the time in America. One of the hugely famous versions of this was by Sinead O'Connor and the Chieftains. They recorded and released that in 1995 to a broader audience, and that specific version has even travelled as far as Russia and inspired a guy called Max Nitsigorодov, who spent a long time translating the lyrics so that the audiences in Russia could understand the story, and he performs it with his folk group, the Wallace Band. I think a song being written by a priest anonymously in 1919, travelling the world and ended up being belted out in a Russian folk club 100 years later in Russian is the power of folk music, really. My favourite version of this song by far is by someone called Derry Farrell, and you can watch his video on YouTube, and his voice is unbelievable, he's amazing. So as someone who's half Irish and half English, it's quite strange playing a song that I'm a descendant of both sides of it, of the conflict. And I suppose that's the interesting thing about folk music, that it's about preserving culture and stories and understanding people's experiences and learning from mistakes so you don't make the same mistakes again, and heed the lessons that the song has inside of it. So today I'm going to play my great granddad's banjo, which was made in 1905 by a guy called Clifford Essex. Clifford Essex is still going today, the company, and the Clifford Essex himself had signed inside this one, so it's a really cool piece of history. And the company, Clifford Essex, shared the Last Play in History video on their Facebook, which was really cool and inspiring, so thanks to them for that. So yeah, let's pick up our instruments and honour the rebels and the tragic choices of a lost generation as I play my interpretation of the Foggy Dew. As down the glen on Easter morn in a city fair there are lines of marching men in squadrons pass me by. No pipe did hum, no battle drum did sound its loud tattoo, and the Angelus Bells or the swells rang out in the Foggy Dew. Right proudly high in Dublin town, holding out the flag of war. It was better to die neath the Irish sky than in Suvla or in Sudalbar. And from the place of Royal Heath, strong men came roaring through, while Britannia homes with the long-range guns sailed in through the Foggy Dew. Well, the bravest fell, and the requiem bell fell mournfully and clear for those who died at Eastertide in the springing of the year. And the world did gaze with deep amaze, all those fearless men, but a few, for the fight that freedom might shine on through the Foggy Dew. And back through the glen I walk again, and my heart with grief is sore, for I parted then with valiant men whom I'll never see no more. And to and fro in my dreams I go, and I kneel and pray for you, 'cause slavery fled, oh glorious dead, when you fell in the Foggy Dew. Thank you very much for tuning in. That was my version of the Foggy Dew. Please like and subscribe, and if there are any songs that you want to hear the history of or anything that you want to share song-wise with me, please get in touch down in the comments. See you at the next one.